The $10 trillion internet lie. Why cutting one cable collapses the global economy. The first thing to go is time. Trading screens freeze, clearing windows slam shut, and flights start stacking on tarmacs because dispatch can't reach servers across an ocean. In one coastal ER, a surgeon waits for live imaging that never loads. The cable was a hose-width thread on the seabed. Someone snagged it, accident, anchor, or intent, and within minutes, milliseconds turned into losses. Here's where it gets interesting. Redundancy exists on paper, but the roots converge where it matters most. Trillions in daily value ride glass filaments clustered at chokepoints. Tech giants and governments know this. The risk wasn't engineered away, it was outsourced to hope. To understand why a single cut can rattle the world, you have to start with the lie we've been sold, that the internet floats in space. It doesn't. More than 95% of intercontinental data moves through fiber on the ocean floor, thin, repeating every 50 to 100 kilometers with powered amplifiers, carrying everything from video calls to the price ticks that settle markets. Satellites can patch a headline, not a trading day. Latency matters. Capacity matters more. The comfort story says redundancy will save us. Multiple paths, diverse landings, automatic failover. But trace the routes and they braid themselves into the same corridors, the Mediterranean into Suez and the Red Sea, the Strait of Malacca, Luzon between Taiwan and the Philippines, narrow shelves along the English Channel and Bay of Biscay. Diverse on the brochure, unified where an anchor drags. The myth isn't that there are many cables, there are. The myth is that they're meaningfully independent, where physics and politics squeeze them together. Stakes, real people, real fast. Global payment rails, swift messages that orchestrate money movement, CLS that nets foreign exchange, equities and derivatives clearing depend on low latency links. Clearing houses live and die by minutes. Add even modest delay and brokers start posting more margin, counterparties widen spreads, and market makers pull quotes to avoid being picked off by a ghost they can't time. Meanwhile, airlines file flight plans against weather and airspace updates fed through those same arteries. Hospitals sync imaging across cloud regions. Remittances that keep families afloat ride the same glass. Hidden outages already happen. You rarely hear the word cut. You hear degradation, congestion, packet loss, and rerouting. Fishing trawlers hook armor, tankers drag anchors in foul weather. Subsea landslides take multiple lines where the seabed steepens. Earthquakes kink conduits. Repairs require permits, available cable ships, weather windows, and a calm sea at the exact spot. 10 days if you're lucky, weeks if you're not. During that time, traffic is herded along fewer lanes, and every queue grows. Procurement made this worse. Cost-minimized routes follow the shortest viable seabed and the cheapest landing real estate. Landing stations cluster in industrial zones with existing power and backhaul. On maps, the pins look convenient. In practice, they turn into single points that share the same fence line. Cables often egress beside busy ports, past anchorages, through shipping superhighways. Insurance priced this as acceptable loss because the model assumed one cable at a time. Reality has a habit of bundling failures, where geography bundles lines. Here's where it gets interesting again. The cloud didn't fix this. It concentrated it. Hyperscalers lease or build capacity on those same bundles, then knit regions together over a handful of east-west trunks. Your multi-cloud architecture still jumps the same choke points because physics gives you only a few corridors that make sense. So when a multi-cable event hits the Red Sea or Luzon corridor, you don't just throttle a region, you reshape latency topologies across continents. We've seen the edge of the problem. Egypt, January 2008. Multiple cuts throttled North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, cascading congestion into Europe. Tonga, January 2022. The Tonga Ha'apai eruption severed the island's lifeline and a nation spent weeks in digital darkness. Baltic Sea, November 17-18, 2024. Multiple systems saw cuts and degradations across a tight window. Taiwan's Ring, 2023-2025. Clustered damage turned a map of options into one thin thread. West Africa, March 2024. Simultaneous faults knocked out huge chunks of capacity, sending routes on long detours with jitter that broke time-sensitive work. None of those were global internet down events. They were test runs that showed how fast isolation scales. The lie survives because of averages. On average, traffic reroutes. On average, users see a slowdown, not a blackout, but averages hide the tails, the financial close at quarter end, the crisis meeting that needs live data, the emergency handoff between hospitals, the air traffic control sector with a single terrestrial backup. Those tails are where risk lives, and those tails grow fatter when routes converge. If the maps are lie, who benefits? Follow incentives. Cable consortia optimize IRR. Governments want cheap, fast connectivity. Hyperscalers want lowest latency between their regions, which favors the same corridors. Insurers collect premiums and pay claims sized to single cable failures, not multi-theater breaks during a geopolitical spike. Everyone gets what they optimize for. No one owns systemic resilience. Meanwhile, attackers read the same charts. You don't need a submarine, you need a vessel, plausible deniability, and an anchor chain. You don't need to cut every cord. You nick a few in the right strait on the right day. Markets do the rest. Spreads widen, liquidity thins, confidence wobbles. Even accidents mimic intent when they land in clusters. So the problem isn't lack of cables. It's lack of independence where they matter and a belief that software can route around geography. We made the network fast. We forgot to make it safe. Chokepoint cartography. To see the lie on the map, you don't need secret charts. You need to zoom out until the spaghetti unthreads into corridors, then zoom in where those corridors pinch. Start with the Mediterranean funneling into Egypt. Dozens of cables descend the Levant, cross the Nile Delta, then squeeze through the Suez, Red Sea Trench. Landings cluster along Egypt's coast because power, permits, and backhaul already exist there. From there, nearly all Europe, Asia capacity threads a 14-mile-wide gate at Bab al-Mandab. When incidents hit that corridor, an anchor dragged, a pipeline blown, a mysterious trawler loitering, an estimated chunk of Europe-Asia traffic detours across longer arcs, latency doubles, and jitter ripples into markets that assumed millisecond stability. Follow that same trunk into the Red Sea and you hit a maintenance paradox. The waters are busy, the seabed is rugged, and repair ships face security and permitting delays. If you're designing a point of failure, you pick a place with high traffic, shallow shelves for easy snagging, and geopolitical noise to hide inside. It already exists. Swing east to the Strait of Malacca and Singapore. It's the shipping superhighway of the planet, and the seabed reads like a highway shoulder carved by anchors. Cable beds and anchorages coexist because both need shallow, accessible zones. Protective burial helps in the first meters. Beyond that, abrasion, trawling, and drag take their toll. A single anchor can tear across multiple cables in one drift. Meanwhile, landing stations around Singapore sit within a few kilometers of each other, fed by the same terrestrial corridors. On diagrams, providers tout city-level diversity. On the ground, some independent routes share manholes and duct banks for the first miles inland. North and east, the Luzon Strait forms the tight ring around Taiwan. It's where Trans-Pacific East-West lines meet the North-South Asian backbone, adds seismic risk from deep trenches, typhoon seasons that complicate repair windows, and the military tension of a contested neighborhood. Fishing fleets are dense. AIS transponders go dark. When cuts hit here, traffic meant to cross the Pacific skews up to Japan or down to Guam and Australia, then back. Cloud backbones recompose, but the detours add tens to hundreds of milliseconds. That's survivable for video. It's a tax on finance, aviation ops, and any system that assumes tight time sync. Now to the English Channel and the Biscay Shelf. Shallow waters, enormous traffic, dense fishing. Britain's connectivity to continental Europe rides bundles that land in a handful of coastal towns, then disperse inland. Dragged anchors remain a leading cause of faults globally. In this region, it's routine hazard. Most breaks get fixed in days. The evidence isn't the outages, those you rarely see. It's the repair ship logs, the issuance of notices to mariners, and the insurance claims. In November 2024, investigators suspected the Chinese bulk carrier Peng 3 of dragging its anchor across both the BCS East-West Interlink and Sea Lion 1 within hours, leaving anchor scars stretching nearly 100 kilometers. NATO frigates surged to the area, and repairs took weeks, not days. A month later, the tanker Eagle S was linked to damage on another Baltic energy data corridor. Different hull, same playbook. Multiply the mundane by scale, and you get systemic risk that masquerades as maintenance. Zoom back to Egypt's terrestrial hinge. Nearly all those Red Sea cables rise in the north, cross the country overland via protection corridors, then dive back into the Mediterranean. There's diversity within that span, but it's bounded by the same national geography and permitting regime. In February 2024, a Houthi missile strike reportedly damaged multiple systems at once near the southern Red Sea, and insurers responded by hiking premiums on the corridor. Some carriers saw double-digit increases, with select policies spiking 40% for transits through hot zones. Past multi-cable events that didn't just slow browsing, they choked wholesale capacity and pushed European carriers to ration. The fact that traffic eventually rerouted is not comfort. It's proof the pinch is real. Here's the part people skip. The last mile is often a single building. Landing stations, windowless, fenced, sometimes feet from a public beach, aggregate pairs from multiple systems, then hand off to a limited set of terrestrial routes. Cameras, guards, and fences help, but the attack surface is concrete and chain link. Flood, fire, or a backhoe with a bad map can pull a surprising amount of weight out of a region. In some islands and developing coasts, one landing, one station, one backhaul equals national dependence. Tonga learned it by volcano. Parts of West Africa learned it when 4 Atlantic systems failed in the same week. Meanwhile, the Arctic gets sold as salvation. In practice, it's seasonal, militarized, and still years from providing meaningful, reliable east-west relief. Most traffic will still prefer shorter, warmer, insured routes. The map's physics hasn't changed. Shortest paths with existing power and permits win. If you want a number to hold, remember this. Around 97–99% of intercontinental data rides these cables. Roughly 90% of Europe, Asia capacity traverses the Red Sea route, and an estimated 17% of global internet traffic depends on that corridor. The exact percentages wobble with upgrades and new builds, but the dependency pattern holds. Hyperscalers own or lease enormous shares of this capacity, yet their separate systems still feed the same straits, shelves, and stations. Private capital accelerated capacity. It didn't invent new oceans. Chokepoint cartography isn't about drawing red circles and shouting doom. It's about acknowledging where diversity collapses into the same trench, the same shoreline, the same fence. It's about how routine hazards, anchors, nets, quakes cluster their damage where roots cluster their glass. And it's about how, when something snaps in those places, milliseconds don't just turn into seconds. They turn into decisions, wider spreads, delayed clears, grounded flights, and surgeons staring at a spinning wheel. Payroll Friday, 9:01 a.m. A cashier in Accra swipes a time card and the screen stutters. The bank API is across an ocean. The cable carrying the authentication handshake is on detour. The store manager tries to run offline mode, but the fraud thresholds trip. By noon, staff are texting relatives for cash because wages didn't land. The accountant calls the provider. The provider blames upstream congestion. Meanwhile, carts line up with milk and rice and a familiar modern fear. The system is working, just not for you. 2 time zones away, an ER coordinator stares at a frozen PACS viewer. A stroke code just rolled in. The neurologist at the hub hospital needs live imaging to greenlight thrombolysis. The slice is taken, the bits march out, then hit a corridor that's suddenly longer and noisier. The viewer spins. The nurse glances at the clock. The drug has a window measured in minutes. They make the call anyway, and it lands somewhere between medicine and gambling. When the report finally renders, the moment's already passed. At a small manufacturer outside Milan, the line halts for an hour that turns into 6. The robot arm won't pick because the vision model lives in a cloud region now straining through a different east-west trunk. The plant had a local fallback, but the latest weights didn't sync overnight. The production manager calls it a software delay. The CFO calls the customer to push delivery and waives a penalty. The penalty is small. The reputational note is not. Here's a desk micro story. A trader's screen blinks from green to grey at 3:27 p.m. London. Market data is still coming, just out of rhythm. He widens spreads to survive the uncertainty, then watches flow evaporate. By close, he's flat, safe, and down 7 figures in opportunity. Risk did its job, the desk did not. The postmortem reads latency event. The team reads between the lines, we were slow when it mattered. Families feel it as absence. Remittances from Dubai to Dhaka that usually land in second stall for days after multi-cable faults in the Red Sea. School portals time out, teachers email PDFs because the LMS won't load. Video calls compressed to voices without faces. For the grandmother waiting on a clinic appointment scheduled by a distant call center, the delay isn't a headline. It's a missed ride and another week of pain. Airlines live by coordination. One morning, dispatchers discover the route optimizer won't retrieve winds aloft from a server that now sits at the wrong end of a choke point. Manual flight plans stack while crews stare at clocks. A few departures leave with safe but suboptimal fuel loads. 3 hours later, a hub banks arrives late, connections misalign, and 1,000 passengers rediscover how brittle global time is when a single hop jitters. Small businesses sit at the mercy of clouds they don't own. A florist's POS won't tokenize cards. A dentist's imaging won't upload to the insurer's portal before a pre-auth window closes. An exporter in Lagos watches a letter of credit hang half-signed because a compliance check can't reach a database in Frankfurt. None of them call their ISP. They call cousins and couriers and do the day the old way: cash, paper, patience. The cost is invisible until month-end books reveal it line by line. If one town hurts, why does an entire country blink with it? Because the roots that make local life modern are shared with everything else that makes the country run: payments, planes, hospitals, markets. We centralized trust in a few glass corridors, then taught every sector to depend on them in real time. We built speed into payroll and care and flights. We didn't leave much room for drift. Meanwhile, in a data center corridor outside Marseille, a network engineer scrolls through alarms. Reroutes are holding, but the buffers are full and the graphs look like stairs. He pings a friend on a repair ship positioning off Djibouti. The reply arrives 2 hours later. Whether window tomorrow, permits still pending. He exhales, strengthens buffers, and adds one more note to the incident. The world keeps moving, just a fraction out of sync. To understand why, we need to rewind to how the web went underwater. The historical context. To understand why, we need to go back to when wire first met water. In the 1850s, empires discovered that messages could outrun ships. The first submarine telegraph cables stitched London to Paris, then leapt the Atlantic. They were copper guts wrapped in gutta-percha, prone to kinks, nicks, and the ocean's indifference. Still, the moment the first signal arrived, faint, delayed, miraculous, power learned a new reflex: reach becomes rule. Within decades, telegraph seabeds looked like rail maps. Along with speed came a new target. In war, cable cutting wasn't innovation, it was doctrine. By 1898, when the United States fought Spain, U.S. sailors rowed to shore and soared through telegraph lines to isolate Manila. In 1914, the British didn't just mobilize troops, they mobilized cable ships to pull up German lines and splice in taps. Subsea infrastructure became both artery and Achilles heel, and navies kept lists. The first nervous system of empire was physical and exposed. Cut a wire, slow a world. Fiber replaced copper, but the culture that grew around roots kept one habit: follow the cheapest path that works. In the 1980s and 1990s, the fiber era accelerated. Repeats every 50 to 100 kilometers let light run continents apart, and a bandwidth boom followed. Cables multiplied across oceans, yet if you traced them with your finger you landed on familiar shores. Egypt's coastline, Singapore's harbor, the narrow ring around Taiwan, England's channel towns. Economics funneled diversity into corridors. Shorter routes meant lower capex. Established landings meant faster permits and existing power. So resilience, the expensive kind, separate trenches, separate stations, true inland backhaul, gave way to efficient sameness. Then came the telecom crash. Capital dried up. Survivors became disciplined about IRR, not redundancy. If a consortium could shave a route by hugging a busy anchorage instead of boring a longer arc across deeper seabed, it did. If two systems could share a landing station campus and duct banks to save months, they would. Insurers priced in routine cuts and paid out. Outages were events, not crises. The culture settled into a rhythm: expand when demand surges, economize when it doesn't. Privatized resilience followed. Instead of governments engineering thick margin into continental lifelines, responsibility drifted to contracts and claims. A single cable failure was an acceptable loss when you could reroute most consumer traffic and send a press release about limited impact. The tails, the minutes that matter to clearing, the millisecond spreads in FX, the emergency handoffs, remained invisible to quarterly reports. We measured averages, we lived consequences. Meanwhile, militaries never forgot the old lesson. Cable charts stayed in war rooms. Submarines practiced cable awareness as navigation, and civilian research vessels learned to loiter near trenches. In public, nations endorsed freedom of communication. In private, they mapped how to deny it. The idea that a dragged anchor could pass for weather wasn't invented by think tanks. It was baked in by a century of plausible deniability beneath waves. The cloud era added irony. Hyperscalers promised availability zones and failover you could trust. They built or leased their own wet plant, invested in new systems, and advertised diverse paths. But physics and permits still channeled those paths through the same choke points. The new nervous system ran faster, carried orders of magnitude more bits, and concentrated more critical functions, payments, health records, airline ops, into facilities a short drive from the same beaches. We spread compute, we inherited geography. Every era added capacity and kept the vulnerability that came free with the map. Telegraph made cutting a tactic. Early fiber made efficiency a habit. The crash made redundancy optional. Insurance made repairs routine. Cloud made everything time-sensitive. And geopolitics made the corridors feel narrower than the ocean they cross. If you want a human artifact that explains our present, it's the cable ship logbook. Pages of coordinates, weather windows, permits, splices, and crew rotations. Each line is a reminder that resilience is manual, slow, and beholden to seas. In the 1850s, a storm could silence a continent. Today, a storm delays a repair that keeps quarter-end stable. The stakes changed, the physics didn't. History also explains the map's shape. Colonial routes tied capitals to colonies, modern routes tie clouds to customers. Both prefer the straightest line between money and control. That's why a single nation's coastline became the hinge between Europe and Asia. That's why a single strait carries the digital breadth of two continents. We didn't design a network to be safe. We designed it to be fast, cheap, and later, when later came, defensible. Later arrived. The geopolitics of the seafloor. While the cables look neutral on charts, the seabed they cross is anything but. States sit at straits and shelves with leverage measured in millisecond rent. Egypt controls the hinge between Europe and Asia. Singapore straddles Malacca. The Philippines and Taiwan ring Luzon. The UK and France frame the channel. Countries that host landings skim fees, set permits, and decide how fast a repair ship gets a window. Countries that depend on through traffic learn to live with vulnerability dressed as trade. This is where maritime geography becomes policy. In the Red Sea corridor, a 14-mile throat near Bab al-Mandab carries most Europe-Asia data. That puts Yemen, Djibouti, and Egypt in the conversation whether cable owners like it or not. Repair crews need security escorts, permits stack, insurance spikes with headlines. A maintenance delay can be a diplomatic calendar. The same physics repeats in the South China Sea. Around Taiwan, fishery zones, military exercises, and disputed lines turn routine faults into tense logistics. A repair ship doesn't just sail, it asks permission from neighbors who don't agree on where the water starts. Meanwhile, big powers treat the seabed like a chessboard. NATO expanded surveillance of critical undersea infrastructure after pipeline and cable incidents in the Baltic. Russia sails survey vessels with winches and excuses. China's digital Silk Road finances and builds systems that land where its trade and influence grow, from the Red Sea to East Africa. None of this is new. It's merely faster, denser, and closer to daily life. What nobody knew at the time, until recent clusters of cuts made it plain, was how easily gray zone pressure can masquerade as weather and anchors. Legal frameworks lag the stakes. The law of the sea protects submarine cables in principle, but enforcement lives in fragmented jurisdictions. If a line fails near disputed waters, who boards which vessel, who proves intent when AIS tracks go dark and an anchor scar crosses two systems at once? Even when attribution is possible, response is slow by design. That gap is a playground, plausible deniability at low cost with high effect. It doesn't take a submarine. It takes a tug, an anchor, and a day when the world is busy. Here's the crazy part. Private owners carry public risk without aligned incentives. Hyperscalers and consortia fund most new wet plant because they need capacity and latency. They optimize for their traffic flows, not for national resilience. Governments, in turn, rely on those same private backbones for public services, then discover during an incident that the control room is in a different time zone and the spare repeater is in the wrong hemisphere. The incentives don't add up to defense in depth. They add up to speed in calm seas. Quiet mapping wars run underneath. Bathymetry surveys labeled research chart routes and trenches with military value. Sensor arrays designed for earthquake detection can also hear anchors and hulls. States publish little, but the pattern is visible in procurement and patrols. This was the moment everything changed for navies. Critical infrastructure isn't just ports and pipelines. It's glass threads over continental shelves. Protecting them means escorts, aerial ISR, seabed beacons, and faster legal lanes for repair ships. Few budgets have caught up. Then there's attribution traps. A coordinated multi-theater break during a market scare looks like sabotage whether it is or isn't. False flags are cheap. A state can stage an accident under another's flag or merely wait for storms to lift anchors and let rumor do the work. Markets don't price certainty, they price belief. If traders think a corridor is hot, spreads widen and liquidity thins long before anyone proves cause. In geopolitics, effect outruns evidence. Countries with leverage behave accordingly. Transit states insist on landing in approved zones and require local partners in station operations. Some push for terrestrial cross-country spurs under their control, turning openness into optionality. Others cultivate redundancy that favors their ports and carriers. Meanwhile, island nations negotiating new landings discover that a single station makes them both connected and exposed. The concession contract becomes national security policy by other means. In the aftermath of every high-profile cut, calls rise for collective protection, patrols increase, task forces announce coordination cells, cable owners test monitoring gear and share more AIS analytics. It helps at the margin, but there's one problem: the system is global, authority is local. A repair ship can cross an ocean in 6 days and wait 6 weeks for a stamp. A frigate can deter loitering in one strait and miss the trawler 200 miles away. Strategy meets seabed and finds friction. So what actually happens when more than one line goes dark? Traffic detours, governments call owners, owners call insurers, insurers call surveyors, and repair ships load grapnels. Financiers watch latency and widen guardrails. Pilots pad flight plans. Hospitals pray the cloud region on the other side of the strait holds. Diplomats draft language that says everything and blames no one. Unknown to most of them, across town, a crew chief checks the weather at dawn and decides whether to shoot the grapnel today or wait for a calmer sea. Everything is about to change when cuts cluster faster than fixes. Case file when one cut wasn't enough. Egypt, January 2008. Mid-morning, traffic graphs in European carrier rooms start to droop. In Cairo, banks complain their trading links feel sticky. In Mumbai call centers, supervisors pace because calls to the UK die mid-sentence. What nobody knows yet: multiple submarine cables, flag Europasia, CMEWE4 and others have taken hits near Alexandria and along the Nile Delta. Stakes: tens of countries leaning on the same corridor. Action: carriers scramble to reroute through surviving strands via the Atlantic, looping down the Cape and back up. Impact: latency doubles or worse for MENA and South Asia. Enterprise VPNs buckle. Some exchanges limp through the day, others impose traffic shaping that feels like a rolling brownout. The repair ship manifests later show the pattern: more than one line damaged, hours apart, in waters crowded with ships and anchors. It wasn't a global blackout. It was a preview of clustered pain when paths share the same shore. Tonga, January 2022. The Tonga Hapai volcano erupts with the force of a small nuclear test series. The blast and ensuing tsunami scour the seabed. The nation's single international cable snaps. Stakes: a country's voice to the world. Action: for days, silence. Satellite phones in government offices, Social media becomes a rumor mill running on the few links that still work. Families abroad wait for scraps of news. Impact: banking halts, airlines suspend bookings, clinics lose access to remote specialists, diggers try to reach a repair window between aftershocks and weather. When the cable ship finally arrives, the crew drags, grapples, splices, manual salvation in slow motion. Weeks pass before normal returns. The lesson isn't isolation alone, it's that redundancy can be a luxury. One landing, one lifeline, one break. Taiwan's Ring, 2023 into 2025. News cycles focus on jets and drills. Meanwhile, on quieter days, fishing gear and anchors keep nicking lines that loop the island and run south through Luzon. Stakes: an economy built on semiconductors and precision supply chains, and a set of trans-Pacific trunks that hinge on these waters. Action: clustered faults take out several local segments within months. Operators shunt traffic up to Japan and down to Guam. Cloud regions recalc paths. Impact: users don't lose all service, but they feel jitter in bursts. For latency-sensitive links, bursts are enough. Payment platforms widen tolerances. Some industrial controls fall back to conservative modes. The repair calendar fills. Permits get complicated by politics. Weather closes small windows. The map still shows many cables. The calendar reveals a dependency on a few good days. UK Channel Islands, 2021. Storm season, heavy seas. A fishing vessel's gear snags two of the three cables connecting the islands to mainland backbones. Stakes: finance, government services, local ISPs. Action: one surviving line takes everything. Engineers throttle non-essential traffic. Voice gets priority. Impact: connections run thinly. A second incident briefly takes the last good link to the brink. Crews race weather, splice under pressure. Residents learn the name of something they'd never considered. A landing station they pass on coastal walks. Diversity existed on the brochure. In practice, shared corridors and shared hazards put all eggs on one stretch of seabed. West Africa, March 2024. 4 major systems, WACS, ACE, Main 1 and SAT-3, report faults within hours. Stakes: more than a dozen countries, primary international capacity. Action: operators detour whatever they can through the Mediterranean or south around the Cape via cables with spare room. Satellite fills headlines, not pipes. Impact: ISPs impose national slowdowns, banks extend clearing deadlines, mobile money apps stutter, call centers go dark. In Accra and Lagos, queues form at ATMs, merchants revert to cash. Internet measurement labs show latency spikes and availability dips that last days. Repair ships work multiple breaks across a long span in challenging seas. The cluster isn't unprecedented, just unusually visible. It shows what happens when geography, economics, and maritime behavior put parallel systems close enough for one sweep of damage to catch many. Mediterranean Red Sea corridor again, 2024. Cable owners announce service degradation after incidents near the southern end of the Red Sea. On November 17-18, 2024, multiple cuts and degradations were recorded in and around the corridor, compounding earlier year incidents and reinforcing the dependency risk. Stakes: roughly 90% of Europe, Asia flows that prefer this route. Action: traffic diverts via longer arcs across the Indian Ocean to the Pacific, then back. Hyperscalers rebalance between backbone segments. Impact: cloud regions stay up, but interregion calls slow. Financial institutions with tight end-of-day windows pad them. Some cross-border payments hold over to next-day settlement. Airlines adjust schedules after dispatch tools time out against distant servers. The headlines call it disruption. Inside NOCs, it's déjà vu with bigger volumes. Pattern recognition hurts here. None of these were total failures, all revealed convergence. They also exposed the hidden clock. Repair: a break near a depot in calm seas with permits ready gets fixed in days. A fault in contested waters, far from parts, in storm season waits. Meanwhile, markets and hospitals and airports don't. The outage becomes a rationing exercise, and rationing turns technical choices into human triage. A micro-story ties it together. In Marseille, a network engineer during the West Africa cluster watches graphs turn into steps. He has a friend on a cable ship off Ghana. The friend texts a photo, grapnel crew on deck, squinting into rough seas, the horizon smeared grey, 2 more days if weather holds. The engineer looks back at his screens, adds one more reroute, and pings a bank contact. you'll be okay, but pushes are tight. Somewhere else, a trader widens a spread, a dispatcher adds fuel, a surgeon doesn't wait for an image. When one cut wasn't enough, it wasn't because the ocean got mean. It was because the map did what it always does: gather our options into narrow places, then remind us that narrow places don't forgive coincidence. The $10 trillion exposure. Here's where the numbers stop being abstract. Every business day, foreign exchange dealers turn over trillions, spot, forwards, swaps, netted through CLS within tight windows that assume transatlantic and Europe-Asia paths behave. A few dozen extra milliseconds across the Red Sea corridor means more exposure sits unnetted at close. Banks respond by posting more margin and widening counterparty limits. Multiply that by hundreds of institutions, and the float alone turns into billions locked up for safety, not work. Equities and derivatives live inside clearing cycles that don't tolerate drift. A futures exchange in Chicago matches orders against risk checks that Peng models mirrored in a European cloud zone. If that mirror is suddenly 2 detours away, micro-latency becomes rejected orders, thinner books, and uncertainty that pushes hedgers to the sidelines. Options market makers hedge deltas across venues linked by those same glass filaments. If their hedge shows up late, they price the risk or pull. Liquidity thins, not because confidence collapsed, but because physics moved the goalposts by a hair. Payment systems carry the same heartbeat. Swift messaging isn't the money, but it's the choreography of money, tens of millions of messages daily coordinating trillions in value. Cross-border wires hop through correspondent banks that rely on synchronized ledgers and sanctioned screens pulled from distant databases. Add jitter to that chain and compliance pipelines slow, false positives spike, and banks batch what they used to stream. Corporate treasurers discover that payrolls crossing borders arrive out of sequence. Late fees and supplier tensions follow. It doesn't make headlines, it erodes margins day by day. Then there's the operational layer most people never see. Airline OCCs constantly ingest winds aloft, NOTAM feeds, and airway flow restrictions hosted in faraway regions. A sustained detour across a chokepoint forces dispatch to fall back to cached products and conservative fuel loads. One hub misses its banks, and you recreate a mini snowstorm without a cloud in the sky. Logistics operators plan intermodal handoffs using APIs that suddenly time out. A delayed JSON becomes a misaligned drayage appointment, a missed vessel cutoff, and an S and OP meeting that turns into apologies. Energy markets read the same drift in a different language. LNG cargoes booked on tight balances rely on nominations, credit messages, and voyage plans that live on cloud platforms strung across Europe, the Gulf, and Asia. Congestion across the Red Sea corridor doesn't halt tankers, it delays the data that prevents demurrage. Refineries running just-in-time crude blends hedge basis risk algorithmically. If curves go sparse because price feeds are out of phase, they widen tolerances or reduce runs. A few basis points here, a lower utilization rate there, real money evaporates quietly. Cloud concentration adds a multiplier. 3 hyperscalers carry most enterprise and public sector workloads, sewn together with a handful of east-west arteries. Inter-region replication, cross-cloud failover, global load balancing. These safety nets assume certain latency budgets. When a corridor stretches, replication lags and RPOs swell. A health system's imaging archive writes slower. A customs agency's risk engine times out on container arrivals. A card network's fraud model drops to a less precise path. Nobody calls it outage. Everyone feels it as friction, and friction priced across large economies becomes GDP drag. Here's the part we pretend satellites can fix. They can't, not at the scale or latency the core economy demands. GEO adds hundreds of milliseconds. LEO constellations help at the edge, but they don't backhaul continents of finance, cloud replication, and global OTA updates at required throughput and latency. Even if they could, ground stations still plug into the same terrestrial backbones next to the same landing stations. At best, they're triage for narrowband and rural. At worst, they're a comforting myth that delays hard choices. What does this add up to in money? Start with the trillion-a-day shorthand for global financial messaging and transactions that traverse these routes: payments, FX, securities instructions, margin, collateral calls. Those flows don't vanish when cuts cluster, costs bloom around them. Extra margin posted because CLS windows widened. Wider bid-ask spreads across asset classes on high jitter days. More demurrage and repositioning in shipping because optimizers ran blind. Higher aviation fuel burn because dispatch flew conservative. SLA penalties for manufacturers whose software-defined lines fell back to slower models. Even a modest, sustained efficiency tax, basis points shaved from finance, 0.1% from logistics, a few percent from cloud egress cost spikes and failover inefficiency, cascades into billions per week in large markets. Latency meets clearing windows in brutal places: month-end, quarter-end, crisis days. A multi-cable event on the last trading day of the quarter doesn't just inconvenience compliance. It forces banks to hold positions overnight they'd otherwise flatten, alters value at risk, and amplifies moves that turn market hiccups into headlines. Aviation hitting summer peaks with dispatch degraded means one more day of rolling delays. Hospitals mid-flu season leaning on cross-site imaging and centralized triage feel longer waits where minutes matter. None of these is apocalyptic. Together, they're a macroeconomic sneer. Productivity takes a hit exactly when cycles are most fragile. Layer in ownership. The big four tech firms now control a massive share of undersea bandwidth. That's capacity, not sovereignty. Their incentives align with speed and cost, not national resilience or sectoral guarantees. Regulators misprice the systemic tail, insurers write policies for single cable accidents, not multi-theater breaks amid geopolitical tension, and markets assume the internet roots around failure, which it does, until the detour is the bigger risk. That's the exposure, not one cable, but one belief, woven into every ledger, warehouse, runway, and ICU monitor that depends on milliseconds behaving like they always have. The incentive problem: who pays for resilience? Follow the money and you'll find the weak points. Cable consortia aren't national guards, they're spreadsheets. A route wins because the IR clears, the permits look tractable, and the landing fees come cheap. True route diversity, separate corridors, separate landings, separate power and backhaul, adds cost you can't pass through easily in markets trained to buy the lowest latency, lowest price wavelength. So boards shave arcs, share stations, and promise redundancy that collapses where the seabed narrows. Hyperscalers don't fix that math, they optimize it. They buy dark fiber, fund new builds, even own wet plant, but the objective function is their traffic, inter-region latency, replication budgets, and cloud egress economics. If two corridors deliver similar performance, the cheaper one wins. If both cross the same strait, so be it. Shareholders aren't voting on geopolitical resilience, they're voting on quarterly margins and growth. Regulators sit a step behind. Telecom oversight was built to police monopoly pricing and interconnection, not to mandate systemic redundancy across borders and seas. When they do weigh in, they focus on domestic last mile or spectrum auctions, while the arteries under foreign waters stay someone else's problem. Even where national security councils care, jurisdiction fractures at the surf line. The result is a patchwork of incentives where everyone benefits from resilience in theory, and almost no one can justify paying for it in practice. Insurance papers over the gap, but only to a point. Policies price single cable faults, routine anchor drags, and predictable repair timelines. Premiums fold into project finance models as manageable line items. Multi-theater, multi-week disruptions amid political tension, that tail risk lives outside the actuarial comfort zone. Payouts help owners, they don't keep planes on time or quarter-end clears on schedule. Markets absorb friction while policies settle months later. Maritime rules complicate everything. Trawling grounds and anchorages overlap with cable corridors, especially near ports and straits. AIS enforcement is uneven. A captain avoiding a storm or a net will drag where he must. The permit writer whose job is to maximize port throughput isn't scored on subsea fault statistics. Fisheries agencies don't co-own cable risk models. Everyone protects their mandate. Resilience falls through the gaps. Governments could underwrite resilience like they do power grids. They rarely do. The cables are private, landings often sit on commercial plots, and cross-border coordination is diplomatic heavy lifting for marginal political reward until a crisis hits. Then statements promise action while repair ships wait for weather and stamps. Budget cycles move on, new shiny projects displace boring redundancy. Meanwhile, customers buy illusions. SLAs promise 5 nines at the application layer, which depend on capacity that looks duplicative until the same choke point takes both paths. Multi-cloud architectures impress PowerPoints, but inter-cloud paths still cross the same trenches. Enterprise procurement negotiates discounts, not seabed separation. The buyer gets what the contract measures. So who pays? Today, no one fully. Owners pay for capacity, users pay for performance, insurers pay for accidents, taxpayers pay after headlines. The systemic tail, those fat-tailed days when cuts cluster and latency taxes everything, goes unfunded. Here's the part that sounds like heresy in peacetime and common sense after an outage. Treat East-West digital corridors the way we treat strategic fuel reserves and airspace. Mandate true diversity on designated routes. Different seabed corridors, land at distinct stations, independent terrestrial backhaul to separate metros and separate power. Tie permits and fee discounts to verifiable separation, audited by third parties with authority to say no. It raises capex, it lowers systemic risk. Price the externality. Levy a tiny resilience surcharge on international capacity, crossing named choke points, pooled into a ring-fenced fund for pre-positioned spares, faster permitting lanes, and dedicated repair ship availability. A basis point on waves and wholesale transit turns into real money when volumes scale. Hyperscalers will argue it's a tax on efficiency. It is, like collision avoidance, is a tax on speed. Align maritime incentives. Designate cable protection zones with AIS-driven enforcement and escalating penalties for violations, paired with practical anchorages that work for captains. Subsidize gear for trawlers that reduces snag risk and create compensation schemes that pay faster than litigation when compliant vessels still get tangled. Make protecting cables the least cost choice on bad days. Fix the last mile problem. Harden landing stations with physical security, redundant power, and truly independent terrestrial egress. Encourage inland meet-me points that don't share duct banks for the first kilometers. Where a nation relies on a single landing, fund a second as critical infrastructure, even if initial utilization looks thin. This is diesel generator logic for the internet. You buy it for when the lights go weird. Change procurement. Require large financial institutions, airlines, and hospitals to attest annually, not to generic redundancy, but to chokepoint-aware diversity for critical workflows. If payroll, clearance, imaging, dispatch, or fraud models depend on east-west corridors, demonstrate separated paths. Tie regulatory relief to proof. The cost lands where the benefit does. Finally, transparency. Publish standardized, independently verified maps that abstract specific lat-long, but disclose corridor-level concentration and station dependencies. Secrecy comforts owners and confuses policy. Markets can price visible risk. They can't hedge marketing. None of this is glamorous. All of it is cheaper than learning the hard way. Again, that hope isn't a resilience strategy. Blueprints for not failing. Start with honesty. Speed without independence is a trap. The fix isn't magical, it's mechanical, geographic, and boring until the day it is. True route diversity means building like you expect bad days, not hoping for cheap ones. Separate corridors, separate landings, separate power, separate inland backhaul, not two lines to the same beach. Two different beaches, two different towns, two different duct banks out to two different metros that don't meet until deep inland. Audit it, certify it, make the checklist painful enough that marketing can't paper it over. Then harden the doors. Landing stations shouldn't be single buildings through a chain link fence with one generator that hasn't been run under load in a year. You want multi-site campuses within a metro, flood mapped, with independent utility feeders, on-site fuel and stored water, and guards with authority to stop a backhoe before it scrapes conduit. Move the first meet-me points inland. Force terrestrial egress on distinct rights-of-way that don't share manholes for the first 10 kilometers. The goal is simple. A local fire, flood, or crew with the wrong map shouldn't drop a coast. Bypass the choke points the map made for you. If your Europe-Asia plan hinges on the Red Sea, you still need the Red Sea, but you also need a second corridor that doesn't. That means new arcs, Mediterranean to West Africa to South Atlantic to Brazil to the US East Coast to the Pacific, or India to Australia to the South Pacific to the Americas. Longer? Yes. More expensive? Yes. Survivable when a strait runs hot? Also yes. You won't run everything on the long arc every day. You'll be glad it exists on the bad ones. Make the sea care. Cable away a maritime zoning isn't romantic, it's rules with teeth. Designate protection lanes where anchoring and bottom trawling trigger fines tied to AIS records, hull insurance, and port access. Pair that with practical anchorages captains will actually use. Subsidize trawl gear and practices that reduce snags. Pay claims fast when compliant vessels still get tangled. Put beacons in the seabed that hear anchors and nets. And ring phones in harbor master offices when something drags across a corridor. At 2 a.m. enforcement works best when it's a nudge before it's a penalty. Speed repairs like your quarter end depends on it, because it does. Pre-position spare repeaters, cable joints and test gear in depots near chokepoints with customs and security pre-cleared. Fund a dedicated repair fleet capacity, a minimum number of on-call cable ships per basin, with standby contracts that pay for readiness, not just response. Standardize fast-track permits for emergency work, exercised in drills, so the first time a form gets filed isn't during a crisis call. Fixing glass is slow. Everything around the splice shouldn't be. Build multi-layer comms like you believe in failure. Microwave cross-border routes that bypass frail coastal shelves. Cross-continent terrestrial rings with real physical separation. Limited satellite triage for command, control and narrowband, hospital consults, airline dispatch messaging, exchange coordination, backed by ground stations not co-located with your wet landings. This isn't about replacing fiber. It's about keeping critical workflows breathing while the ocean reopens. Pre-negotiate emergency peering and rationing. When corridors stretch, the scramble shouldn't start with lawyers. Draft templates today that let carriers, cloud operators, and national IXPs announce temporary priority lanes for critical sectors, clearing ATC, emergency medicine, without tripping antitrust or privacy alarms. Publish rationing protocols in peacetime, then run them. Finance can test quarter end on bad path latency. Aviation can file plans off cached products. Hospitals can simulate cross-region failover with constrained bandwidth. Drills expose the places where your redundant app depends on a single DNS record in the wrong region. Make trust visible. Public dashboards that show corridor health at a high level, latency, packet loss, available capacity bands, turn rumor into data and panic into patience. Banks widen spreads when they see jitter, not tweets. Airlines pad schedules when they see dispatch feed drift, not whispers. You don't need to publish that long. You need to show risk in a way executives can act on without calling a friend at a carrier. Align money with physics. Offer fee discounts and fast-track permits for projects that prove real separation. Levy tiny surcharges at named chokepoints to fund spares, ships, and monitors. Tie regulatory relief for critical sectors to annual attestations that their lifeline workflows avoid shared fences and trenches. Call it a resilience reserve. Basis points today to avoid percentage points later. Fix the last mile to the cloud. Hyperscalers should land in more than the usual suspects, with independent terrestrial on-ramps into their regions that don't share the same culverts with everyone else. Require cross-cloud corridors that avoid obvious pinches and certify inter-region replication paths that survive a chokepoint with bounded lag. If your imaging archive or fraud model can't hit its RPO on the long arc, you don't have resilience, you have hope. None of this is rocket science. It's civil engineering with a tide chart and a calendar. Pick separate beaches, separate rooms, separate roads, separate power. Pay a little more now to avoid paying forever later. Because a hose-width thread on the seabed shouldn't decide if a surgeon waits, a pilot holds, or a trader widens a spread. Resilience isn't a promise. It's a build list on land, at sea, and in contracts, finished before you need it. Adversary Playbook: How to break the web quietly. Start with cover. You don't need subsurface drones or exotic tools. You need time on water, a map of corridors, and something that looks like work. A trawler with nets, a cargo ship with a loose anchor, a research vessel with survey gear. Plausible deniability is the first instrument. Choose a place where accidents happen anyway, busy straits, crowded anchorages, shelves where burial is shallow, and let physics write your alibi. Then sequencing. Single faults get headlines and fast repairs. Clusters cause rationing. Pick a window when weather is marginal and permitting is slow, storm seasons, holidays, regional tension, so the queue for repair ships grows. Nick one cable near landing at dawn. Hours later, scar a parallel route 20 miles downrange. By evening, find the terrestrial hinge and stress a duct bank with a backhoe incident that takes an inland spur. On the public dashboards, it reads like bad luck. In NOCs, it feels like a squeeze. Tools are low-tech by design. A dragged anchor cuts armor and core with the same indifference it used on pipeline casings. A bottom trawl sweeps a lane and snags more than fish. If you're bold and trained, a submersible can place shaped charges on a repeater housing. If you're careful, you target spans between repeaters where the plant is thinner and easier to splice, more breaks per day of repair. The point isn't spectacle, it's throughput. Create more faults than the basin's ships and weather windows can absorb. Meanwhile, watch the clock. Markets are not a 24/7 blur, they have pressure points. End-of-day CLS windows for FX, month-end margin cycles, quarter-end securities settlement, airline summer peaks, hospital seasonal surges. Aim for a Thursday before quarter close when banks need clean nets and cannot roll exposure. Hit a Red Sea segment on the eve of a major OPEC meeting so energy desks, already nervous, widen spreads. Time a lose-on nick ahead of typhoon forecasts to pin repair ships in port. The ocean does the deniability, the calendar does the amplification. Pick targets that shift behavior, not just bits. Cloud interregion trunks matter more than consumer streams. Terrestrial egress out of landing stations that feed financial hubs dense more than video. If two cables exit the same fence line, a single incident near shore puts both on the floor. If that fence sits beside an industrial zone with lax zoning, a warehouse fire becomes an outage. You're not attacking the internet generically. You're inconveniencing specific arteries that move money, planes, and care. Here's where it gets interesting. Attribution is a trap you set for others. The ocean keeps secrets. An anchor scar looks the same whether it's negligence or intent, and a net snag is 1,000 times a year accident you can hide inside. Turn AIS off at the right moment, then flood the lane with spoof tracks days later. Stage an anchor drag under a third country's flag, then sail a research vessel through the aftermath broadcasting compliance. Seed social channels with chatter about routine maintenance while a different strait goes soft. Intelligence services can piece together hull scuffs and anchor scars. Markets won't wait. Perception is a weapon. Confidence thins on rumor as surely as on proof. Use geography's gift. The Red Sea's 14-mile gate concentrates Europe-Asia flows. Incident density there multiplies effect. Luzon's ring ties Pacific East, West to Asian North-South. A pair of faults forces long arcs that tax hyperscaler budgets. Malacca's anchor-raked shelf lets one bad drift find many cables. The Biscay and Channel shelves combine shallow water with fishing density. Fault rates are routine. Your incident hides in the noise. Your craft isn't destruction. It's composition. Layer routine hazards until operators face rationing decisions they've never rehearsed. Coordinate with noise elsewhere. While cuts settle, run a denial-of-service campaign against public status pages so dashboards go dark just when executives seek calm. Target a regional cloud authentication endpoint with a burst that looks like misconfiguration. Force enterprises to toggle controls mid-incident and create self-inflicted brownouts. Trigger bogus BGP announcements in a minor AS on the other side of the map. Keep engineers chasing phantoms while your real pressure sits underwater. The point isn't persistence, it's confusion that elongates response. Economics favors you. Repair fleets are finite, roughly dozens worldwide, and some basins run with razor-thin spare capacity. Spare repeaters, joints, and lengths of cables sit in depots that require customs and security stamps. Move those stamps off desks with a localized strike or protest, and the clock stretches. Insurance policies price single cable accidents. Owners will file and wait. You're not paying for downtime. Everyone else is. Banks in extra margin, airlines in fuel, hospitals in minutes. Keep your footprints small. Don't hold terrain, touch and fade. Don't cut where burial is deep and surveillance high. Graze where burial is light and enforcement split between agencies. If a Navy frigate arrives, you wanted that. Deterrence resources burning hours on visible patrols while your trawler sails 2 straits away. If a patrol boards a compliant captain, the lesson still spreads. Tension rose, behavior changed. False flags are your endgame. After the cluster, leak hints of culpability that fit your opponent's priors, an image of a vessel with a rival's flag near a fault, a found tool on a beach, a report from a think tank seeded with selective AIS. Watch as regulators overcorrect, imposing abrupt routing or inspection regimes that add friction for months. Markets price that friction long after you've moved on. The last move is restraint. You don't want blackout, you want a tax. A world that assumes near-zero latency starts living with random tolls, wider spreads, thicker buffers, slower clears. Confidence takes longer to repair than glass. And the next time a storm lifts anchors in a choke point, you can leave the tools ashore and let fear do your work. Defense and depth at sea. Defense starts with knowing, not guessing. Along the corridors that matter, seabed ears listen. Fiber-optic DAS lines, hydrophones, tilt meters, quiet sensors that feel anchors scrape, nets drag, or repeaters groan. Overhead, patrol aircraft and drones run slow, boring racetracks, while AIS analytics flag trawlers that go dark at the edge of cable protection zones. The pattern isn't cinematic. It's statistical. If a vessel slows, swings beam on, and its GPS track paints a comb over a known trench, a harbor master's phone rings before steel meets glass. Meanwhile, maritime authorities redraw the water. Cable-aware zones sit like invisible lanes. No anchoring, no bottom trawling, fines tied to AIS trails and insurance policies. It only works if alternatives exist, so ports extend anchorages and publish bad weather playbooks captains trust. Trawlers get subsidized gear that rides shallower and snags less. When the sea turns ugly, the least cost choice becomes the safe one because enforcement is predictable and compensation arrives faster than lawyers. On land, the doors harden. Landing stations that once looked like anonymous warehouses become small fortresses, redundant grid feeds, on-site generators regularly tested under load, flood berms mapped to century storms, and 2 distinct terrestrial egress routes that don't share a duct or bridge for the first miles. Cameras watch the fences, more importantly, permits watch the backhoes. A city can keep paving while fiber crews sleep if a single excavator turns 2 diverse paths into one cut. Defense here is paperwork that moves faster than rebar. Resilience lives in layers above the beach. Microwave hops bridge borders over hills where coastal shelves are fragile. Cross-continent terrestrial rings with honest-to-God physical separation take weight when a strait runs hot. Satellites, GEO for bulk alerts, LEO for narrowband triage, carry the lifelines that keep people calm while the heavy traffic waits. Airline dispatch text, hospital consults, exchange coordination, emergency messaging. Nobody pretends space replaces fiber. It buys minutes that matter. Repairs shift from art to logistics. Spare repeaters, joint kits, and cable drums sit in depots near chokepoints with customs pre-cleared and security escorts assigned by name, not title. Standby contracts pay a minimum number of cable ships to be fueled, crewed, and within range, not just available. Drills run on bad tides, so the first time a grapnel touches seafloor with a new crew isn't the day a bank stretches its CLS window. Paper becomes muscle memory when the weather finally cracks open a window. Defense is also peering without panic. In peacetime, carriers and hyperscalers negotiate templated emergency MOUs. When corridor jitter breaches a threshold, priority lanes light up for clearing, ATC data, emergency health traffic, and grid control, without spending 12 hours with antitrust counsel. IXPs rehearse rationing modes so best effort doesn't become every app for itself. Cloud regions stage constrained bandwidth drills. Hospitals watch their imaging archives meet RPO on the long arc or fix what doesn't. Finance rehearses quarter end on worst path latency, then adjusts buffers before it's real. Trust needs a public face. High-level corridor dashboards, latency bands, packet loss, available headroom, publish enough to replace rumor with reality, abstracted from exact lat long. Banks widen spreads on data, not tweets. Airlines pad rotation when dispatch feeds slip, not because a CEO's text thread got nervous. Owners gain a shield, transparency that inoculates against speculation when accidents happen in clusters. NATO's Baltic Sea Cable Protection Center, stood up in 2024, now watches undersea infrastructure around the clock, but monitoring isn't defense. Defense is having repair ships and spares within 48 hours of a cut, not 48 days after the weather, permits, and paperwork finally align. None of it works without aligning money. Resilience surcharges, basis points on capacity sold through named chokepoints, feed a ring-fenced fund for depots, ships, sensors, and fast-track permits. Fee discounts and quicker approvals reward builds that prove true separation, different beaches, stations, power and roads audited by third parties. Fisheries grants underwrite snag-reducing gear, port dues drop for vessels that respect cable lanes in foul weather. It's dull economics tuned to physics. Defense at sea means watchstanders with patience and checklists that stand up when politics shakes. NATO task groups add seabed patrols to pipeline and cable sweeps. Regional coast guards share queuing from seabed beacons and open-source AIS. Intense waters escorts shadow repair ships until grapnels are back on deck. When a flag state drags its feet after an incident, multilateral pressure moves faster than accusation. The goal isn't to militarize a trench, it's to normalize protection as routine seamanship. Finally, accept failure and bound it. Critical sectors attest annually, not to generic redundancy, but to chokepoint-aware design for their lifeline workflows. A hospital's PACS shows cross-region replication that survives a Red Sea stretch. An airline's dispatch proves it can file and fly on cached products for 12 hours. A clearinghouse runs its end of day on the long arc and still closes. Defense in depth isn't one big wall. It's layered humility, sensors that feel, rules that steer, doors that hold, paths that split, ships that sail, contracts that click, and people who have already done the hard thing before the sea demands it. Micro stories, lives at the edge of the cut. The ER coordinator in Accra keeps her palm pressed to a mouse that doesn't listen. The PACS viewer pinwheels, thin blue ring stalling over a CT slice that matters. She glances at the clock, counts backward from the drug's window, and toggles to a cached low-res series that looks like fog. On a second line, the hub neurologist's voice cracks. I still don't have it. She makes the call anyway, mouth dry, a guess wrapped in protocol, and hopes the line she can't see is clear enough to save a brain. At dawn on the Biscay coast, a fisherman throttles down when his net comes up wrong. Strands are frayed and glitter with glass fibers like frost. He swears, cuts away the tangle, and stares at the coordinates stamped in his logbook. He knows the charts say no bottom gear here, but last night's wind drove him off the mark. 2 weeks later, a letter arrives. Investigation, anchor scar, liability. He tapes it to the fridge beneath a photo of his boat and counts what a new trawl will cost. In a quiet landing station outside Muscat, a guard walks the fence line while breakers slap the beach. Inside, the room sounds like air, fans, UPS hum, a distant click of a relay. A contractor in a high-vis vest signs the log, heads for a rack, and opens a panel the width of a hand. Think of it this way, a continent's conversations funneled through something smaller than his lunch box. His phone buzzes with a photo from his kid, first day at school, while he labels fibers that can bankrupt a city if he gets them wrong. A repair ship out of Djibouti lifts on a low swell. The bosun's gloved hands feed grapnel line over rollers scabbed with old scars. The crew moves like they've rehearsed it in a hangar, slow, quiet, patient. They feel the seabed through the cable, tension spiking when steel whispers against something that isn't sand. A junior tech leans over the rail, tastes salt, and tries to imagine the traffic rushing through the dark beneath them. He can't. He knows his job ends with a splice. Someone else will decide what the delay cost. In Lagos, a market woman checks her phone, frowns, and asks the customer to wait. The mobile money app spins, then times out. She sighs, pulls a notebook from a flour tin, and writes a promissory line next to 2 tins of mackerel. Tomorrow, she says. She has said tomorrow a lot this week. At night, she adds up the paper IOUs and thinks about the time her daughter's school fees are due. The math is simple, the timing is. Network engineer in Taipei wakes to an alert tone he knows too well. He pads to a desk, opens a laptop, and watches utilization bars stacked like stairs. His mother asks if he wants tea. He nods without looking up and starts moving routes like puzzle pieces, each change a trade between congestion and reachability. He doesn't think about jets or drills. He thinks about a fishing zone that always runs hot after storms and a permit that expires in 6 days. The tea goes cold, the graph settles, he texts a colleague, hold until repair window. Mid-flight over the Atlantic, a captain gets a company message. Plan updated, extra fuel burn approved, maintain holding pattern. She looks at the weather clear and shakes her head. The dispatcher will explain later, data feeds came late, they flew conservative. In row 23, a man misses a connecting flight and a meeting that took weeks to set. He texts apologies he doesn't mean and blames weather that didn't exist. In a small clinic in Tonga, a nurse places a satellite handset on a counter like a relic. It works, sort of, and only for short calls. She phones a supplier about vaccines, waits through a delay, and writes a new date on a cardboard box. The island is back online now mostly, but everyone remembers the weeks when nothing moved but rumors. She keeps the handset charged in a drawer anyway, not out of fear, but respect. A teenage coder in Alexandria refreshes a dashboard that once served as a screensaver. Now it's a habit. Latency, packet loss, corridor health. He builds a small app that changes color when the Red Sea breathes. His father asks why he watches the sea in numbers. Because it decides my homework, he says, and smiles like he's joking. He is. The next 10 years, 3 futures. Drift looks busy on paper. More cables, more capacity, more press releases about diverse paths that still share beaches and shelves. Project finance keeps favoring the same corridors because permits are faster, power is nearby, and the route is shorter by 60 nautical miles. Landing stations multiply as rooms in the same building, duct banks leave town in the same trench, and east-west arteries concentrate because everyone assumes the sea will stay calm. It works most days. On the wrong days, simultaneous breaks are not black swans, they're math. Clusters force rationing, repairs wait on weather and stamps, markets price jitter with a quiet tax. A decade of drift ends with bigger failures that fail faster. Latency spikes on end-of-quarter Fridays. Airlines plan summers like winter storms. Hospitals rehearse imaging detours as policy. Public trust thins as limited impact becomes the new check back later. Managed risk feels slower, but it's survivable. Regulators and owners agree on corridor-aware standards. Separate seabed arcs, separated landings with independent power, inland meet-me points outside flood maps, and terrestrial egress that doesn't share manholes for the first 10 kilometers. A resilience surcharge, basis points on capacity through named chokepoints, funds depots, standby ships, and pre-cleared permits. AIS-policed cable protection zones steer anchors and trawls, backed by practical anchorages and fast compensation for compliant captains who still get snagged. Hyperscalers publish attestations for lifeline services, clearing, ATC, PACS, grid control, proving those workflows can ride the long arc within bounded lag. National drills flip networks into rationing mode without lawyers in the room. It costs more upfront, but outages shrink from weeks to days, days to hours, and hours to minutes that matter less, because priority lanes light up on cue. Overcorrection rides fear. A cluster during a geopolitical flare tips policy from risk to rivalry. States militarize routes, escorts shadow repair ships, inspections slow innocent traffic, landing approvals hinge on national vendors, interconnection tilts toward blocks. East-west becomes east versus west. The map fractures into trusted fabrics with fewer cross seams. Security improves inside each camp. Global resilience doesn't. Duplicate capacity blooms in parallel, not in depth. Enterprises carry 2 stacks, 2 clouds, 2 compliance worlds and pay for both. Latency across political seams becomes price, not physics. The internet still routes around damage, it now routes around diplomacy too. Friction becomes a feature. Innovation slows at borders. For hospitals, airlines, and markets that cross seams, the new threat isn't outage, it's permission. The cost curve decides where we land. Drift is cheapest on capex and most expensive in crisis. Overcorrection is expensive always and brittle where seams meet. Managed risk pays a little every day for buffers you barely see, pre-positioned spares, split beaches, inland meat mess, patrols that feel boring, and drills that look theatrical until they aren't. Boards will ask for numbers. Here's the one that matters. 0.1% shaved from productivity each year by recurring friction is a larger bill than building separation once and maintaining it. The choice is not whether we pay, it's when and whether the payment buys margin or theater. Here's the thing about incentives. They move when someone writes the rule. Telecom oversight can mandate chokepoint-aware diversity for designated lifeline corridors the way airspace rules mandate separation. Finance can tie operational relief to attestations that quarter-end clears on worst path latency. Aviation can require dispatch to prove cash-only modes work for 12 hours. Health regulators can certify PACS replication across long arcs. Hyperscalers can publish corridor health and fail over visibly without reputational fear. Ports and fisheries can enforce cable lanes with AIS and pay claims fast. These are line items, not speeches. Climate sits under all of it. Storm seasons shift, shelf erosion rewrites burial, and windows for safe splicing slide on calendars that used to behave. Managed risk anticipates that wobble with surplus. More ships within reach, more parts nearer to choke points, more staff trained to splice when seas finally lay down. Drift calls it waste. Overcorrection calls it sovereignty and still waits on storms. We built a network for cheap miles and sunny days. The next 10 years test whether we can rebuild it for long arcs and bad weeks. Drift bets on hope. Overcorrection bets on walls. Managed risk bets on shoulders, the extra room that keeps a cut from becoming a country's bad day. Pay a little now or pay forever later. Back to the opening question, who cuts first and why did we wait? The sober answer is that accidents will keep doing the work of adversaries until incentives change. And if an adversary ever decides to compose the sea into sequences, you'll know which future we chose by how long it takes your hospital image, your flight plan, and your close of day to arrive. Water doesn't decide our future here, glass does, and it frays where we made speed cheap and safety optional. If you work in finance, aviation, healthcare, or energy, your business runs on threads you've never seen in places you can't control. CTOs audit choke points, not slide deck redundancy. Prove your lifeline workflows survive the long arc. CFOs fund real separation, different beaches, stations, roads, and power before you fund the next feature. Boards ask for corridor-aware attestations the way you ask for SOC 2s. Share this with the people who sign permits and budgets, because the next cut might not be an accident, and by the time you're staring at a spinning wheel, it'll be too late to buy resilience. Watch our next episode on the choke point nobody guards until the day it fails.